Alright, so this video that you're watching today is about Gene Wolfe's Pirate Freedom. Pirate Freedom came out in around 2007, I believe. I really love Gene Wolfe. I have two Gene Wolfe related tattoos, both of them from the solar cycle. One from the Book of the New Sun, one from the Book of the Short Sun. Um, Yeah, I haven't read that much late era Wolf. I have read his final two books, A Borrowed Man and Interlibrary Loan, and I enjoyed those a fair amount, but honestly, not as much as I enjoyed the book we're going over today, Pirate Freedom. Alright, so now I'm going to give you some biographical factoids about old Gene Wolfe. Wolfe was born in New York City in May of 1931. He had polio as a small child. Him and his family moved to Houston when he was very young, I believe at the age of around 6, and that's where he ended up going to high school, is in Houston. Wolfe initially attended Texas A&M. That's where he had his first short story published in the Texas A&M literary journal for undergrads. He dropped out during his junior year at A&M, and he was pretty swiftly drafted into the Korean War. He most likely suffered PTSD from the Korean War. He talks about in an interview that when he got home from the war, that loud noises made him hit the deck, made him fall to the ground and think he was under attack. He does say in the same interview that he credits his wife Rosemary with rehabilitating him back into polite society. So Wolfe eventually graduated from the University of Houston, and when he graduated, he worked as an industrial engineer, and he helped come up with the machine that makes Pringles. The whole Pringles thing is a very big meme among his fans. You'll often see memes about it and people talking about it, people mentioning it online. Wolfe was the editor of Plant Engineering for many years. He left his job at Plant Engineering in the 1980s, I believe in 1984, to pursue writing full-time. That was after the massive success of the Book of the New Sun, which seemed to allow him the freedom to write full-time. So Wolfe lived in Barrington, Illinois for most of his adult life. He had 4 kids. Wolfe's wife, Rosemary, she died in late 2013. This was a major blow for Wolfe. I believe Rosemary had Alzheimer's as well as a few other health conditions. And Wolfe himself died in April of 2019. So Wolfe is most well known for the Book of the New Sun, which is a dying Earth story that's continued in Earth of the New Sun, which is like a 1-book coda to the original 4-book series. And then it's also continued in the Book of the Long Sun and the Book of the Short Sun. Long Sun and Short Sun are not direct sequels. There's only 1 or 2 characters that kind of continue on with the book, but they are set in the same general world and the same general timeline. Book of the Short Sun is probably my favorite thing that I've read by Wolfe so far. Pirate Freedom does have some similarities with Short Sun. But Wolfe's first book came out in 1970, which was Operation Ares. His first notable work, his first mature work, was The Fifth Head of Cerberus, which was 3 interconnected novellas. Ursula K. Le Guin always called Wolfe the Melville of our times. Wolfe was inducted into the Sci-Fi Hall of Fame and also named a Sci-Fi Grandmaster. He won a World Fantasy Lifetime Achievement Award. He won 1 Nebula and multiple Locus and World Fantasy Awards. He was nominated 24 times for Hugos and Nebulas. He's kind of known for being a writer's writer. He was quite popular amongst his author contemporaries. So now I'm going to go over the plot of Pirate Freedom. The opening interlude is about a priest named Chris, who's eventually we find out is the main character. He's taken the confession of somebody who murdered somebody, and he levels with the confessor that he himself had murdered someone in the past. The man insists on hearing the story of the priest murdering someone, and that's what sparks the idea for the book. The whole book is the priest, Chris, writing a book to explain how he had murdered someone, and it's meant It was meant to be an explanation that he mails off to the guy that was confessing to him. So in chapter 1, the narrator Chris describes going to a Catholic boarding school. He's a lot younger now. Once he's old enough to graduate from the boarding school, he's offered a choice to stay and become a monk or leave. He chooses to leave, and once he does, he discovers that he has somehow traveled back to the past, although he doesn't yet realize it in chapter 1. Or he's slowly coming to terms with it, maybe. And then in chapter 2, the narrator joins up with a ship. The ship leaves port. The narrator gets gang raped 2 different times, which is not described in any great detail, but it is there. But he adjusts to life at sea fairly quickly. In chapter 3, the ship arrives in Veracruz, and the narrator explores the town. He becomes friends with a priest. The priest is helping serve some slaves that are working on a monastery or like a church. They're helping construct it. Chris also meets some British sailors who will become important to the plot later. Then the ship leaves port, headed for Spain. In chapter 4, the ship arrives in Spain. The narrator messes around the port town. He plays the organ for a Catholic church, and he plays a guitar he borrowed from a priest in some taverns. Him and the priest have a kind of back and forth about the guitar and whether or not he can have it or not. So by the end of the chapter, the ship has left port again. In chapter 5, the ship suddenly gets taken over by pirates, who are the British sailors the narrator met in Veracruz. They're led by Captain Bert. We find out the narrator's name finally, which is Chris, or Cristoforo, or Christian. The pirate captain takes a liking to Chris and offers him his own pirate ship if he behaves himself. But Chris turns down the pirate captain due to his morals, not letting him steal stuff. The pirates take over a Spanish ship full of slaves after a short fight. Despite Chris's protestations, the British captain leaves Chris in charge of the new ship, and they part ways. Chris's ship is supposed to head to England to sell the slaves. He has to fight one of the 6 men left to crew the ship, and he fears that the rest will do a mutiny. But he tries to run the ship in a more humane manner than what he had experienced before. In chapter 7, they arrive in England and sell the slaves, and then they fix up their boat and sell it. And then the crew and Chris make their way back to the New World, America, the Americas, to meet up with their original captain. Once they arrive, Chris yet again refuses to work with the captain, so this is his second refusal. So the captain maroons him on Hispaniola. Chris is on Hispaniola and he makes his way inland, away from the beaches, where he meets another stowaway, another person who was marooned, named Valentin. They start hunting together, and they're companions for a month or 2. And then Chris and him split up, and Chris falls in with a group of French hunters. Chris is really good with different languages. I believe he speaks French and Spanish and a little bit of Italian and English as well. He eventually has to duel with one of the French hunters, and he kills his opponent, which I believe is the murder he talks about in the beginning. There are other parts where he kills people. I kind of forget. So the group goes to Tortuga to buy supplies. When they return to the wilderness, they are accosted by a Spanish ship. The Spanish ship fires cannons at their camp and kills some of them. They then have to decide what to do next because the Spanish have told them that they will kill them on sight. So then the group is ambushed by the Spanish, and after a long fight, they try to parley with their enemies. But they are captured and told to sail back to Tortuga, which they do. And once they arrive in Tortuga, they steal a Spanish ship. In chapter 10, Chris gets his crew organized. He then finds out that his prior love interest, who is a woman from the Spanish port town, I forgot to go over this. The woman buys a gray parrot from him, and it's on Chris. Chris seems more enamored with the woman's servant, which comes up later. How the two are kind of similar. The woman and her servant. Chris tries to play guitar for the servant and hangs around the servant's house trying to get her attention. This is earlier in the book. But yeah, so he finds out that his prior love interest, who I'm assuming is the servant, is he finds out that she stowed away on the ship and pretended to be a man, but she reveals to him who she is, and they are soon a couple. They have an election on the ship for who gets to be captain, and there's only one other guy who even wants to be captain. Chris gets more votes than the other guy. And the other guy wants to fight, and they duel, and Chris wins. They stop. Then in chapter 11, they stop at an island called Fat Virgin Island. They make a bunch of repairs there to the ship, and Chris buys a female slave, Azuka. Azuka had been Chris's friend's companion earlier in the novel. I believe it was Lesage who Azuka was his romantic companion. I'm kind of skipping over a lot. This book is longer than most of the ones I review. Anyway, so chapter 12, the beginning of the chapter concerns Chris in the future going over his library's books on pirates. And then back in the past, they capture another boat, a Spanish one. This crew splits up and then later meet back up. When they meet, Chris has a long conference with the man he appointed captain of the new ship and a man in the other ship he captured. So chapter 13, so while they were all talking, a Spanish ship had kind of crept up on them. There's a short fight, and the Spanish ship captures them and their ship. They're put in the hold, but Azuka steals a dagger and frees everyone. So Chris and the rest do an uprising and kill the Spanish crew and take back over the ship. In chapter 14, they run back into Captain Burt, the British captain. Burt tells Chris about a plan he has to steal a bunch of gold from the Spanish. Chris agrees to participate. In the middle of the chapter, we get a scene from the future featuring Chris as a priest talking to a bishop and discussing stuff like pride and lust. Pride and lust are both a major theme, or both major themes in the past for Chris. So Chris and his girlfriend, who he calls Novia, are reunited. She had been taken away by the Spanish, I believe. So they no, because they split up and Chris was on a different ship whenever the Spanish came up. So yeah, the reason they're reunited is they find their original ship, which it turns out has captured a different Spanish ship. Chris discovers that there's a woman on board, and there's perhaps treasure being hidden somewhere on the newly pirated ship. So Chris interrogates and fights the owner of the new ship, and he discovers there is some type of ghost or monster supposedly killing people on the ship. The deaths are initially attributed to a ghost or a monster. We find out different later. So in chapter 17, the crew trains themselves on how to handle the ship, and Chris discovers the woman who is hiding in the ship, but not the treasure. So in chapter 18, I found this part really confusing. The girl who was hiding on the ship turns out to be Chris's girlfriend's former master. The two girls fight, and Chris verbally explains the entire situation. I found this very confusing because I believe that Chris, I don't know, I'm kind of blanking on Chris and which one he thought he was with at the beginning, but the two women seem to be confused with one another. So then in chapter 19, they arrive in Jamaica and they begin refitting and selling the ships. Chris lets both of the women go back to Spain with money, and Chris reunites with some of the British sailors. At the end of the chapter, Chris goes to sleep and discovers his love interest is back and hasn't abandoned him. And the ship leaves port. Chris realizes that his love interest would take over as captain if Chris died. She's kind of she's a really good sailor. She's good at fighting. She's very strong-willed, and the men respect her. So the ship gets in a long-range battle with a Spanish galleon, and Novia helps run the gun successfully. So she's very integral to the running of the ship. So Chris and his second-in-command talk to the mayor of Tortuga for a while, and then they leave Tortuga and they sail around Hispaniola. Chris stops the ship to go onto land and try to find Valentin, his old hunting buddy. Eventually, he discovers a dead Valentin in a cave they use to store supplies. He's not 100% that the dead person in the cave is Valentin, but it seems likely. So another man is mysteriously murdered on the boat. And back in the future, Chris and the other priests discuss how priests molest children. Chris kind of makes an ass of himself by saying that the children should have defended themselves and, beat up the priests. And if they were trained to beat up priests who tried to molest them, then this wouldn't happen. And Chris is accused of victim blaming. This comes up a lot in reviews and people talking about the book, that section. But in the past, the ship sights a Spanish ship, and in the middle of the night, they conquer the Spanish ship. In chapter 23, there are 2 more murders on the ship, and the crew grows uneasy, so they leave the ship behind, and one of the crew members sets fire to the ship. The stowaway who had been murdering people is seen on the deck, but the stowaway dies in the fire. Then Chris and his second-in-command discuss what has been happening and why. It's kind of a complicated plot about the owner of the ship and his wife and how he sleeps with his friend's wife who's on the ship, and how there's all this adultery, and it's very confusing. But the stowaway, we think, is one of the owners of the ship, or the owners of the ship friends. The friend of the owner of the ship, the original owner. So in chapter 24, the crew work on the ship. Working on ships at this time was adding tar to their bottoms and working on the sails and doing a bunch of different stuff like that. And Chris confers with Captain Burt about their scheme for stealing gold from the Spanish. Chris and Captain Burt are worried that people know what they're up to. In chapter 25, the pirates combine forces under Burt and ally with a Native American tribe. They split their numbers in half, and half march to a Spanish city, and the other half take their ships to the city to act as the ships act as a diversion when the others invade from land. So they take over the city, and they take over the stockade, and Chris and Captain Burt try to parley with the fort, and they're taken hostage, but they eventually are free themselves and help the pirates take over the fort. And the gold that they were going after had yet to reach the city, however. So they turn around when they figure out that there's a pirate. And the gold train, which is all donkeys, people carrying the gold that turned around when they figured out that there's a pirate army around. So the pirates vote to go after the gold, and they do. There's a long chase, and Chris and some others, after the chase is unsuccessful, choose to go back to their ships. They get chased away from the city by the Spanish Navy, and then the ship captains, including Chris and his wife, Novia, have a long talk about what to do next. So the pirates try to grow their ranks with loggers and from capturing other ships, and this is successful. Chris is marooned near a Spanish city where he is supposed to be a spy for 2 weeks. During the beginning of his time in the city, he finds an inn to sleep in, and he buys a Native American slave who speaks English. The Native American slave had been beaten almost to death by his previous masters, so the slave is pretty amenable to helping him. So Chris and his slave do spy stuff around the Spanish city. They think that they are fishing and explore the coast and get really close to all the fortifications along the water. At the end of the chapter, Chris fakes his way into the main fort that guards the city, and he's given a tour. Then Chris and his slave make their way back to the pirate ships. Chris reunites with the other pirates and confers with Captain Burt, and they go over different options for attacking the city. They come up with a good plan, and they execute it successfully. So successfully that they almost instantly become super, super rich. And then the pirate ships stock up and refit in Jamaica. And then they make their way around the southern tip of South America, where they experience horrible weather. That's called Drake's Passage now. It's around Cape Horn, south of Cape Horn. I've actually been on a ship that traversed the Drake's Passage from South America to Antarctica. And on our way there, it was horrible. Then on our way back, we went through a hurricane that had 50-foot waves and 125-mile-an-hour winds and stuff. It's a famous place. It's a place that's infamous for bad weather. So they make it to the Pacific, and their lives are instantly easier. They make their way to the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are depicted as a sort of paradise. The pirates wait around, in chapter 32, the pirates wait around for Spanish ships carrying gold to emerge from the coast. After 10 days of just kind of lazing around, they spot the Spanish ships. And then the pirates and the Spanish fight for a whole day, but the Spanish disappear in the middle of the night, and the pirates split up to find them. Chris's group of ships discover them heading towards Panama. They went north and east, and they engage the Spanish ships while another ship heads to gather the rest of the pirate fleet. So then they chase the Spanish, but the Spanish ships make it to Panama, and they unload their gold. So the pirates try to cut them off while they cross over the land, like the Isthmus of Panama. They eventually do cut off the train of gold, and they're aided by another group of pirates who's headed by Lesage. Chris knows Lesage from earlier in the book. They succeed in taking the gold, but in the middle of the night, the two groups of pirates end up fighting each other. Chris is almost killed, and he runs away into the jungle. He makes his way back to the camp eventually, and he finds everyone is dead, or almost everyone, because he finds that a mortally wounded Captain Bert, and he talks to him a little bit until Captain Bert dies. Then Chris takes Captain Bert's treasure maps, which depict where he stored his treasure. In chapter 34, the final chapter, Chris is reunited with Novia, his Spanish love interest. Novia escaped from the same pirates who attacked Chris and his men by hopping off the ship and swimming ashore. They make their way to Mexico, and they encounter a priest from Chris's time at the Catholic school in Cuba from the beginning. This is kind of weird because that Catholic school is technically in the future. But Chris leaves Novia with the priest, and Chris makes his way to find Captain Bert's treasure. But his ship is sunk in a hurricane. He is saved by Mexican fishermen who have a radio, which lets Chris know that he's back in the future, just not as far back as when he was living as a priest. And then Chris kind of skates over, becoming a priest in America. And then at the end of the book, he makes his way back to Cuba to become the priest he leaves with Novia earlier in the chapter, who's called Ignacio. And the book ends with his vision of him and Novia back in the past, finding Captain Bert's treasure and having enough money to sail around the world. Alright, so now I'm going to go over the world of pirate freedom. The frame story in the book involves the main character, Chris, living as a priest around the time when the novel was published. There are some pretty key differences, though. Chris says that he was genetically engineered to be tall. In America, the America of the book, the modern day America, seems to use monorails much more than they did at the time of 2007 or even now. The book also depicts the communist regime in Cuba falling, which, that hasn't happened even now in 2023. So yeah, the book could depict an alternate present for the time it was published or a near future setting. The Catholic Church of the novel seems basically unchanged from reality, including, which I went over, the mentions of sexual abuse scandals among the Catholic clergy. So the main part of the novel, the part set back in the past, it depicts Chris as an initially reluctant pirate during the golden age of piracy, the late 17th century. As far as I can tell, the book is historically accurate. I'm not an expert, but Chris does deem himself such an expert that he corrects some of the modern day supposed misconceptions about the time period. I have read some nonfiction about pirates when I was younger, and some depictions of life at sea from around this time. Everything seemed to make more than enough sense. And Wolfe handles the complicated jargon of sailing ships from around this time. He handles it quite well. The book is also somewhat feminist, I would say. It shows women leading crews of male pirates. It shows male pirates listening to women and allowing them to be leaders. And it also showcases women being equal to or superior to men in areas such as combat and sailing. Wolfe gets into this in the novel, but there are historical examples of women being pirates, sometimes even leading pirate ships as captains. So now I'm going to get into my opinions and analysis of the novel and kind of review it a little bit. So I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed this book. I've seen it mentioned on Reddit here and there, and I figured the book would be kind of a low-stakes affair, perhaps lacking in Wolfe's usually dazzling prose, pyrotechnics, and all of his genius puzzle making. But the book is almost always very easy to follow along with. This is not true of all of Wolfe's books, but I found this book very legible. There were a few parts I found somewhat nebulous and confusing, but overall I loved how I didn't have to figure out what Wolfe was getting at constantly, like in stuff like the Book of the New Sun. The prose of the novel is really quite good. It's not as flowery or ornate as many of the other works by Wolfe that I've read, but it's super concise, and that works well with the subject material. It is written in a style reminiscent of the Book of the Short Sun, with multiple timelines and a man reminiscing about the ups and downs and highs and lows of his past, and kind of wrestling with the ethics of what he's done in the past. There are small digressions in the book about historical accuracy, and Wolfe does state some concessions to how the book differs from what a typical reader would expect from a book about pirates. This is especially true in the depictions of Chris in combat, where Wolfe will say, in a pirate movie, this fight would have lasted 5 minutes, but in reality, it was just one sword thrust that ended it, or something. But the frame story depicting Chris as a priest in the near future, or on an alternate Earth, that part contains some of my favorite parts of the novel. I was often very eager to get back to the pirate parts, but the parts about being a Catholic priest were still more than entertaining enough to hold my attention. The book does ruminate on faith and the highs and lows of organized religion, and that felt thought out and possibly drawn from Wolfe's own life experiences as a faithful Catholic man. There are some criticisms with the novel that say it contains victim blaming, when Chris says that the victims of sexual abuse by priests should have fought back and defended themselves. I also understand what Wolfe was getting at, though, because he's right in some ways that if the victims of this sexual abuse had defended themselves physically, then less damage would have been done. He does kind of get into how violence is more and more discouraged as time goes on. That being said, that kind of sexual abuse trauma can be quite paralyzing in the moment. So I understand both sides of the argument. It does seem like Wolfe, through his character Chris, does seem to be lamenting, or Chris himself perhaps and not Wolfe, seems to be lamenting the loss of the type of masculinity depicted in the book's pirates. Chris can come across as rather lacking in empathy during the book, which plays into what I was just talking about. He brushes off the accusations of victim blaming without really giving them a second thought. He comes across as callous and uncaring at times. I wouldn't go so far as calling Chris a psychopath, but the way he emotionlessly wrote about stuff like horrid torture techniques in the pirate parts, and he also talks about how he beat up some kids from his parish when they challenged him, and that does seem to speak to how distant Chris is from normal human emotions. Chris's own father is depicted as emotionless. Chris's father is, you can kind of read between the lines and get the fact that Chris's father is probably in the mafia, because the reason Chris goes to the monastery on Cuba originally is that Chris's dad goes to Cuba to run a casino, and just kind of leaves Chris with the monks and forgets about him. So that could be where Chris got it from. Gets his views on violence and how emotionless he is. Chris's mother is never mentioned once. And yeah, like I said, Chris's father is almost certainly a member of the mafia. So Chris could have grown up in a family that was completely lacking in warmth, kind of like Severian in Book of the New Sun. Chris is definitely an unreliable narrator. That's a trope that Wolfe constantly leans on throughout his whole oeuvre. I don't think I've read one book by Wolfe that doesn't, at some point or another, depict an unreliable narrator. So an example of how unreliable Chris is that Chris is followed into the jungle by a Native American woman, and Chris claims they did not do anything sexual besides a kiss or two, but the woman in the next chapter thinks that she's his wife, which causes a lot of confusion with Chris and Novia and Azuka. So that implies that Chris and the native woman did a lot more than just kiss. So could be lying to us. Speaking of, Chris is pretty much depicted as a womanizer. This is another way he's like Severian from the Book of the New Sun. Since Chris seems to kind of assume that all women are attracted to him, and he also seems to attract more women than he can handle at any one time. This part of the book is a bit annoying. Chris's love problems, do take up a good amount of space in the book, but I would say they don't really add much to the book besides creating drama and tension between him and Novia, his wife. This could be an example of Chris exaggerating stuff, exaggerating how attractive he is, and exaggerating his past. Or it could just be, Chris is celibate when he's writing the book, so it could be a symptom of that, since the whole book is written from Chris's perspective when he was a Catholic priest. So the parts that confused me the most were the parts where Chris can't seem to tell the difference between the woman he sells a parrot to earlier in the novel and her female servant. That whole thing could be explained away by Chris having a spotty memory, I guess, but he's supposedly in love with the woman's servant. So the fact that he mistakes the two did not really make sense, although it could be a puzzle that just went over my head. I did have a few different thoughts on that that I didn't write down, but it's possible that Chris has facial blindness. The thing about that is Chris is very good at recognizing other people in the book, so that seems kind of not what was being depicted. I did think that perhaps the two women were sisters, and the servant was just pretending to be the lady's servant, which would make the lady and her servant, look very similar if they were sisters. So that's why Chris kind of gets them mixed up. That part confused me. I was also confused by how Lesage just happens to be in the right place at the right time during the novel's climax, because Lesage's pirates help them ambush the people carrying the gold in Panama, and just kind of appear out of the blue. I have seen some stuff online about how Lesage could be Chris's father and or another time traveler, which would explain things some, although you would expect Chris to recognize him if that were true. You'd think that Chris would recognize his own father. I have seen some explorations of Lesage's name being a possible nod to Lesage being Chris's father. Lesage means the sage in French, and a sage person would be a wise person. And people in the mafia are called wise guys, and Chris's dad is in the mafia. The description of the two is also the one description we get of Chris's father is pretty much the exact same description we get of Lesage. And I have seen some discussion that Lesage could have read the book that Chris wrote, the book Pirate Freedom, and therefore had prior knowledge whenever he went back in time. So some parts of the sci-fi world building also blew right by me, like the mention of Chris being genetically engineered to be tall. I didn't remember that from my own read. I only got that from reviews and online discussion. I just don't remember that being stated, but I assume it is. Overall, I really love the book. It does have some of my favorite parts of the Book of the New Sun and the solar cycle, in that Chris is writing a book, and the book is, like the Book of the New Sun. The Book of the New Sun is written by Severian, and it's a book in the world of the Book of the New Sun. And also the book Pirate Freedom could very well exist in the book, in the world of Pirate Freedom. I'm not sure I'm explaining that well, but the character is writing a memoir in both of them. That's also true in the Book of the Short Sun. I would recommend this book to more or less anyone, people that are fans of pirates, who's not a fan of pirates, people that are a fan of sci-fi, people that are a fan of Wolfe. There's not really anyone I could think of that I wouldn't recommend this book to. Fans of Wolfe will probably rejoice in how easy the book is to read, while others may just enjoy the action and the historical accuracy, because Wolfe definitely did a lot of research. So as for a grade for the book, I would give it an A-/an A, which is a pretty high grade for me. The only other late era Wolfe I've read is, like I said, A Borrowed Man and Interlibrary Loan. I'd probably give both those books a B/a B+. I enjoyed them. I thought they were really good, but I didn't think that they were exemplary or outrageously good. But I very, very much enjoy Pirate Freedom. Yeah, thanks for listening. Like and subscribe.